For our discussion today, we have with us a panel of educationists drawn from different parts of Africa, and they have their various experiences on the topic for today. First, I have Mrs. Thandi Ngengedule. She is the Assistant Director of Southern African Committee for Higher Education, SACED. Next, I have Mr. Deochund Sookhoo, who is the Secretary for the Tertiary Education Commission of Mauritius. And last but not least, Professor Olu Jegede was previously the Dean of the Faculty of Education, University of Abuja in Nigeria, but currently at the University of Southern Queensland in Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to look very quickly on how distance education has been used at pre-tertiary levels, considering, for instance, the big issues of quantity, the numbers that we have to deal with, particularly in developing countries. What would you see as the role of distance education in coping with such large numbers? Thandi Ngengedule, perhaps you might elaborate on this and bring in perhaps the experiences of SACED.
Thank you very much. I think that I here want to take the opportunity of sharing with you some of the problems that we have had to solve in our country and the countries that we cooperate with in the Southern Africa region. Distance education has become a major tool that we use to back up the overflow of the number of pupils that drop out at secondary level that cannot be coped with by the formal school. We have used distance education in a number of situations where students cannot continue in the formal education in the secondary level. And then further, we are finding that with the changes that are happening in the southern region, there is a lot of coming back of some of the people in South Africa that have been in the outlying states, our neighboring states. And we think that distance education is important in that area because many of them are not yet at tertiary level.
And many may have actually interrupted their education because of all various reasons, and some of them, of course, were studying outside the country. And that group of returnees, obviously, will need further education and further training. And perhaps the emphasis and perhaps more resources ought to be devoted to the training at pre-tertiary level. And perhaps here, through the experiences of Mauritius, which did have distance education program for school-age children, we might get some experiences here from Sookhoo, who is from Mauritius.
Yes, in Mauritius, following the Jegede conference that was held in Bangkok some 2 years back, we have developed a master plan for education, wherein we have proposed major reforms in the education system at primary and secondary level. What we have done is we have identified the issues at both levels. For example, in the primary sector, there are 170,000 children, and out of that cohort, there are some 27 who reach standard 6. And out of the 27,000, we have only 60%, 60 to 70% who pass the CPE. And so we have a dropout of about 35 to 40%. At the secondary level, we have also the problem of dropouts. We have a pass rate of 60% at the secondary level, that is from Form 1 to Form 5. And again, we feel that distance education will be a major instrument to cater for the needs of those dropouts. At the same time, we have identified the problems that are connected with teacher training. We feel that to be able to improve the quality of teaching in the primary and secondary schools, teachers have to be given further training through distance education. At the same time, we have other major concerns expressed by the government. For example, we have performance in certain subjects like economics, like the sciences, which are declining in the secondary sector. not only the pass rate, but also the number of students who are offering the science subjects and also economics. So we feel that distance education will be of major help. But as you have just said, we have also some experience of distance education already. We have the Mauritius College of the Air, which caters for the children in the secondary, in the primary and secondary schools. The MCA mounts programs that cover the school certificate and higher school certificate syllabus. There's also one major concern which we feel these days with the financial stringencies, that is management of resources, where we have to train our head teachers in the primary schools, our rectors in the secondary schools, and also all those who are concerned with the cost-effective use of resources.
Certainly, the whole issue of quality is important, in addition, of course, to quantity. And certainly, the institutions in the developing countries have this big responsibility of training the teachers. Because otherwise, how do you bring in quality in education? How do you bring in excellence? And certainly, perhaps, distance education ought to be directed more and more to the training of teachers, including the support personnel, the supervisors, the administrators, the inspectors, and so on. Obviously, the problems of Mauritius are big in themselves, but of course, looked at another angle, you are well advanced. You take another huge country like Nigeria. And Dr. Jegede, I'm sure, could give us an overview of how it is that, in fact, in a huge country like Nigeria, the training of teachers is taking the form of, obviously, distance education and short face-to-face meetings during their residencies. For instance, when you were Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University of Abuja, was this a major concern?
Thank you very much, Peter. As you have said, Nigeria is it's a very big country. I think it's the largest population-wise in Africa, with over 88 million people. And when you look at the situation in Nigeria, a country developing and depending on education, and rightly so, as the major weapon for transforming the human resources for an integrated national development, you have no other choice but to look for alternative non-contiguous and different from face-to-face kind of education. And what we have found and has helped the country is the issue of distance education. It's been such a success that the country has been investing very heavily in developing an institution called the National Teachers Institute. I'll give you a brief historical development. When in the 70s, the federal government of Nigeria decided that there will be universal free primary education, we found that there were over 2 million children ready to go to school. And it immediately dawned on government that the central focus for training these people will be the teachers, because the teacher is the pivot of any educational process. Without the teacher, you cannot talk about presenting the ideas or materials, let alone talk about quality. And so we immediately had to decide on training these teachers using a non-traditional form, and this was distance education. And now we have been able to train thousands of teachers scattered all over the various regions of Nigeria. Of course, Nigeria has got 30 states plus the Federal Capital Territory. That's right. And there are distances, and people are far removed from urban centers where they will go to school. So the teachers are scattered all over, and so are the children. And so we have been able to train a very big force that is transforming the education at the primary and the secondary level. But I must say that there needs to be a movement, not just in Nigeria, but in other African countries, towards other areas within distance education, not just at the primary level, not just training the teachers, but the majority, as we found, of the population in developing countries are youth. Right. And only 10% will ever get to go to universities. So if you then say 10% will go to university, you want to provide an equitable access to education, which is being seen as the instrument of development. Therefore, there is a need to reach out to the remaining 90% of the population to wipe up illiteracy, to make sure people are well informed, politically and otherwise. And this is the strength of distance education in developing countries.
That in effect, through the use of distance education, people will not be limited by distance or by time or by their geographical location, whereas really in the school education, they have to be within the walls of a conventional institution to receive the information and the instruction. And obviously, the huge proportion of youth in all the developing countries cannot be neglected. We can only neglect them at our peril. And really talking of youth and the young persons, one must also think of those who have been deprived before through no fault of theirs. Again, somebody mentioned about the Jomtien Conference on Education for All, at which obviously the place of women and young girls, for instance, and as far as their education is concerned and further training had been neglected in the past. Is there a role for distance education in trying to reach or re-reach those who have been denied before? And perhaps here, really from the experiences of Southern Africa, we would like to hear whether, in fact, there is an attempt towards reaching those who have been deprived of education and further training in the past.
I think I want to come in at that point, Peter, to say that that is the experience that we are currently trying to harness in the southern region. In our country, in South Africa, for example, one would be looking at the kinds of people, the youth that have been deprived of education because of the various systems in the countries. We have here, for example, a situation of about 8 million people that have been thrown out of the education system, as you have rightfully said, due to no fault of their own. And most of those people that are in that situation, needless to say, are girls and are the young women and, of course, the older women in the country. We are currently saying that the kind of education that we should be talking about should not necessarily be the kind of education that is akin to the straight, formal education, but it must be an education which is equitable and also gives you the kind of quality that makes people come back to the formal education. It has currency, it can be useful. And women, again, in this situation, are the hardest hit. But distance education, through distance education, we see a kind of education that educates the nation through the women. And of course, also allows the women to still be able to take on their rightful position, do some of the things that, needless to say, you gentlemen don't have to do. Tender the children and make sure that life continues. And distance education allows for that kind of education.
Obviously, investment in the education and training of women must receive greater emphasis. And perhaps it might be one of the best investments in education. And I'm sure the World Bank, is aware of all these things. Because, again, really, through conventional methods, we have hardly reached half the population. And yet the world is changing so fast. But let me pose a question here. When you are talking of younger people and the youth, are they able to cope really with the rigors of distance education? Are they disciplined enough to sit and actually do some work and do written assignments on time? Or could we build in more of the student support services with distance education? I believe that through the use of distance education materials, we can build in quality. And in some cases, better materials are being produced through distance education systems than the conventional educational system that goes on in the classrooms. Some of the bad teaching goes on in our own classrooms. But in distance teaching materials, because they are in the public purview, they actually are, in many cases, better materials. But the role of student support services. For a country like Mauritius, where most of the population is the youth, how have you tried to build in those support services to ensure that there is lower dropout rate for those who may not really have the rigors of having to discipline themselves to sit and study at a particular time, submit their written assignments on time? Sookhoo.
In Mauritius, our problems are rather different from what you have just painted. In the primary sector, the enrollment is around 98%. And from that figure, you can gauge that you have both girls and boys in equal numbers, more or less, who attend the primary schools. And in secondary sector also, we have boys and girls attending secondary schools in equal numbers. So the nature of problems in Mauritius is different, you see. But I mentioned the problems of dropouts, both in the primary and secondary sector. Now, for the primary sector, those who fail the CPE, these children are being catered for by the IVTB, the Industrial Vocational Training Board. The IVTB runs courses in basic education, English, French, so as to improve their communication skills, so as to improve the content of certain subjects. The IVTB also runs courses in draftsmanship for those who have dropped out from the secondary sector. Now, to come back to your question, what we are doing in the distance education field, we have set up the student centers in the secondary schools. And the secondary schools have been set up on a regional basis. So the teachers can go to the student centers for tutorials. But actually, this we are starting as from next year. We are not in full swing with the program.
Well, experiences drawn from another country near Mauritius is in Malawi. Malawi has, I believe, one of the best secondary level programs through distance education. The Malawi College of Distance Education has done what I believe to be a tremendous good work with these young people. And what they have done is, in addition to the print materials and the radio programs that are broadcast nationwide, they have a very systematic support system in all parts of the country, using the existing facilities in schools and community centers. And really, they find that that kind of support system helps to reduce that dropout rate. Because, mind you, these dropouts from the school systems have had bad experience. They may have had bad teachers. So their experiences back there really don't render themselves well to actually go back to school. But I think through the individual learning and individual support system that they are given, and they don't have to compete with the student next in the next desk and so on, they have found that so long as the support services are systematic and regular, they have managed actually to cut out their dropout rate by 50% in the last 15 years. And obviously that augurs very well for other countries to know that, again, good as the distance education materials might be, if you neglect the support services and tutorial systems and advice and counseling, you are really dissipating a lot of energy that has gone into producing good materials. And here again, when you are training the teachers, you are also helping the teachers not only to be professionally qualified in performing their tasks, but also to upgrade their level of knowledge. And I think that bit of academic upgrading is also necessary in the training of our teachers, because some teachers are being asked to cope with subject levels or subject areas that they themselves are weak at. And so training of teachers is not just the pedagogical upgrading of skills. I think there is also the academic upgrading. And here perhaps Professor Jegede, who was the Dean of the Faculty of Education, might perhaps see how might tell us how perhaps this balance has been maintained.
The issue of balancing professional and academic qualification has been addressed in Nigeria in two ways. The first is looking at balancing between the subjects that are taught, because as you rightly said, a primary school teacher might find himself in a classroom and for the first time being asked to teach science that he never studied before. And so we made it possible for the teacher who is going to teach at the primary school and going through the distance education program learns both sides of the coin, the humanities, arts, and the sciences, so that he or she will be adequately prepared for such teaching. The other area is the balancing of the professional, that is the pedagogical education courses, and the academic courses. I mean, if you spend too much time on learning how to teach and not on what to teach, then of course you find a teacher who will go into the classroom faced with about 40 or 50 children, knowing how to teach and not what to teach. So again, that issue has been balanced in such a way that you have about 60 to 70% of the time taken up by what he's actually going to teach, and between 30 and 40% being taken up by the professional development about how he's going to teach it, taking into consideration the development of those he's going to teach, their sociocultural background, their psychological and other areas. But one issue I thought I should bring in relation to the previous one, you talked about reaching as many people as possible, particularly the disadvantaged groups. And in this case, we talked about women, but I think we should also understand that in other developing countries, there are other disadvantaged groups. In Nigeria, for example, we have the nomadic people who go up and down the country taking cattle all over. These people are contributing so much to the economy, and yet the country is not giving them anything in return. So the federal government of Nigeria decided that for such group of people, they are going to mount education, and that the tyranny of distance will not deter anybody. Correct. So in fact, one of the services is that you go out to these nomadic people and mount schools along the routes they go up and down the country, and their children are given the same kind of education that other people receive. There are other areas, of course, of those who are disabled. There's a tendency to think that within a developing country, because you are disabled, you're no good. And I think this is an area, again, that is being addressed. I quite appreciate it, and there are several other areas in addition to women. And of course, I mean, girls have always been, the second rate in quote in developing countries. People think that their places in the kitchen and not anywhere else. And in most cases, they should not, be heard. But I think we should change our thinking without harming our culture negatively, and make sure that you train the women, because once you train them, of course, you've trained the whole nation.
So in Mauritius, those who join the primary schools, they have the required qualifications. So they satisfy content-wise, but what is lacking is the pedagogical methods. So before really working in the primary schools, they undergo a 2-year training course at the MIE, the Mauritius Institute of Education. So this is the method we use to balance content with the quality. But at the same time, recently we developed the primary curriculum development project, after which we again trained the teachers in all the schools. We organized briefing sessions in methodologies and also in contents, because the contents in the primary syllabus was reformed. And in the secondary sector, we run the certificate and diploma courses for the secondary school teachers. But here we have a problem of quantity. We have worked out that over a period of 20 years, there are only some 30% of those secondary school teachers who have got some sort of training. So now we are going for distance education, because that's the only way out to be able to train such a huge mass of teachers who have not got any sort of training. So as from next year, we are taking a first batch of 1,500 teachers who will be undergoing training through the distance education mode. That will be a 2-year part-time course, 93, 94. That will be followed by another batch of teachers, 95, 96, and that will go on like that.
Let's turn very quickly to the issue of costs. Everything costs money. What resources are available?
I think that I want to take you up there, Peter, on the issue of costs. Earlier on, you referred to the importance of the kinds of support that we need for distance education. I think that we should acknowledge that by definition, distance education is a very lonely way of studying. For those people that have to study away from where the teacher is, for those people that have to rely on the printed materials, Peter has ably actually stressed the importance of ensuring that we have the kinds of supports that can be mounted in the various communities that these people come from. And I think that we have to reckon with the fact that the the student support systems take up a lot of costs. It is where we actually have to pump in as much resources as possible. Because not only do we need the physical support, we also need the kind of people, your counselors, your tutors, and the administrators that ensure that that kind of support for that learner is ably mounted. And we in our organization have found that about 30% of the budget for the distance education activity is taken up by that kind of support. And we think that that is important. It is very important that we should actually pump in as much more money in that kind of activity as possible.
And obviously, the different governments are required to give in more resources.
Yes.
And would you say then it's a better investment in education in terms of, say, economies of scale, that with existing facilities you're able to reach more people?
I think that I would put my head on the block and say that it is very vital that the different governments should put in as much financial support in that kind of activity, because as you say, economy of scale, you are reaching more people, and we should reach and target more of the disadvantaged and those that have dropped out as much as possible by distance.
Peter, there's no question about the investment that any government could put on education and people. I had said earlier on that the human resources, that's the greatest resources that any country can ever have, right? And if you want to develop rapidly, and you want to take care of your economy, your politics, your whatever, the investment on the people is infinitesimal compared with the outcome you are going to reap. And in any case, studies have shown in other parts of the world that distance education, because you can reach so many people at a particular time, because you don't have to duplicate several things here and there as you do in classrooms, is in fact cheaper than the classroom education. The other point we need to look at in costs is that developing countries should, much as they don't have the money, must look for them. I mean, as they say, where there's a will, there is a way. If you have to train these people, then you must look for it. Maybe you need to adjust your budget to make sure you take care of these people first, and then go ahead and do other things. But it's also necessary, very necessary, that we again consider the non-dollar output. In this case, the affective dimension. We are not just saying it's money in, money out, and you put a dollar sign and say, how much did it cost me to get this person to get a certificate? We are saying, and this is the focus, or this, to my mind, should be the focus of developing countries. What has education done for the individual himself? We are not just saying we are training you because you're going to get a job. That has been the wrong song being sung in the traditional education. You give somebody the impression in a developing country that once you go through the primary, secondary, university, there's a job waiting for you.
That's
It
right.
is no more the case
kind
now.
of a factory, a conveyor belt from the beginning to the end.
But at the moment, what we are saying is that we want you to be able to analyze situations, whether they're economic or political or whatever, in a way that will enrich you as a person and make you contribute to your society. In that case, that reward has no dollar sign at all. It is much more than it.
What about a body like the World Bank? Do they think in those terms, or are they talking of inputs and outputs only?
The World Bank, in fact, is applying a lot of measures to see to it that the money is well used at both primary and secondary levels. In fact, the World Bank is saying that we have to put more emphasis on primary education, where investment pays off more than the other sectors. In Mauritius, actually, we are facing some financial stringencies. Actually, we have effected a 1% cut on the budget, on the current budget this year. And our budget in the Ministry of Education is already the largest budget of the government. So we feel that we cannot go on increasing our budget. So we feel that the way out is using distance education to train our teachers.
Let's talk something about the attitudes of parents, the attitudes of the community, the attitudes of the employers, and so on. How do they see the products of distance education?
I have noticed One, that there is no significant difference in the performance on the job of somebody who has been trained through distance education and the person trained through the conventional school type. Indeed, as an educationist, I would put on my head and say that those who have been trained through distance education have got more provisions, they've got more facilities, they've got, in fact, better preparation.
Better discipline.
Better discipline and whatever than those who have gone through the formal training. People may argue about that, but I think I've got indications, you know, to prove that this is what is happening. Because, as you rightly mentioned, within the face-to-face teaching, the teacher, in most cases, he's left on his own to prepare his lectures. Nobody looks at it. And he goes to the class and he says whatever. He might spend within the 40 minutes allotted for a lesson. He spends 20 minutes telling stories, another 20 minutes giving him whatever, and he might be worried about what's going to eat next. But within distance education, these materials are produced, they are designed and developed, they have gone through what we call, in quote, an industrial kind of preparation that makes sure that you talk not only of quality assurance at the beginning, you are also talking about quality control towards the end. And so these people have got, I mean, if you like, 100% of whatever you can give them. And so when they come out, they are better prepared, you know, they're ready to do the job, and they do it very, very well. In fact, in the next 15, 20 years, my feeling is that most people will have to go towards distance education, and developing countries with the teeming population and with dwindling economies, we have no other choice but to reach out to the greater mass of the people through the widest possible means, and this is distance education.
However, I think that, Peter, we should also acknowledge the fact that what you are talking about is very much related to the issue of quality of the materials that we use. I think that the kinds of attitudes that might be wrong, but might be negative, come from the fact that we probably, in distance education, have used materials that are not very qualitative. So I think that a lot of resources have gone in to ensuring that the materials of distance education are, one, qualitative, and also they allow the learner to learn to be independent. I think a lot of our school-based formal education has been criticized for making the learners very dependent on the teacher. And as you have said, sometimes the teacher is not necessarily the best of resources to learn from. So those people that have come from very good distance education institutions have come out very tops as people that are very independent, and they can actually input into the development of their societies very well.
Certainly a very noble aim to achieve, you know, to produce independent learners, people who can work on their own, well-disciplined. But I'm still asking that question, are the parents convinced that distance education is as good as conventional education? Or has that yet to take time?
I think it depends on not only on the quality of the materials, but also what parents and maybe employers look at is also the duration of the course. The duration of the course, the course contents, which should be comparable to the conventional courses offered elsewhere. And for example, in Mauritius, we have the National Equivalence Council, which caters for it, because in Mauritius, we have various ethnic groups. And people go for studies abroad in a lot of countries. When they come back with their degrees are certified by the National Equivalence Council. It's certified that what they have followed abroad is equivalent to, say, the British universities or French universities. So once that's done, that certificate is recognized by the employers.
And I think then that, of course, will mean that everybody around the country knows this qualification is accredited around the world and so on. And I think these are the systems that need to be introduced. Olu?
Yes, and indeed, what one needs to look at is, like as mentioned, the curriculum. And you find that the curriculum is the same whether the person is doing it by distance education or is doing it by the face-to-face method. So once the curriculum is established as being equivalent, then the issue of acceptance by the society is not there. Indeed, parents are happier this way because it's cheaper for them. The child can or whoever can sit down at home and do his studies and still contribute effectively to the day-to-day running of the house. It is also cheaper because the parent will not, they will not rack their brains about where am I going to get all these thousands of naira or whatever to send them to schools, So it's cheaper for them to do that. Time factor, it is also a very important thing. And what they are studying is independent of space. So they don't have to go and take us anywhere. They can do it wherever they are. So I think the community and parents have come to realize that, that is a viable option. And in fact, a more pragmatic option than, sending somebody to school and going distances.
Obviously, distance education is moving towards the mainstream of conventional education, and one can see them really acting as partners, that where the conventional system is inadequate, distance education comes in to buttress it. And really they should not be seen as antagonistic or in competition, but rather complementary. And really through these various systems in existence, the issues of quantity of education, quality of education, costs of education will be resolved perhaps much more amicably and perhaps in a much shorter time than really leaving it out to what we know in the past as conventional education. Well, thank you indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity of sharing these views, particularly on the developing world and the role of distance education.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.